My dad's new girlfriend stole from him, but he chose her over family. Hey Reddit, I'm Ethan, 30, and my life has been a mess ever since my mom died unexpectedly last year. She was the glue that held our family together, and losing her was devastating. But things got even worse when my dad, 62, started dating his new girlfriend, Sandra, 50. She seemed nice at first, but it quickly became clear that she was after more than just his affection. My dad refused to see it, and when I confronted her about stealing money, he sided with her over his own son. Here's how my family fell apart in the wake of my mom's death, and the nightmare that followed when my dad let a stranger into our lives. My parents, David, 62, and Margaret, were the epitome of a happy couple. They'd been married for nearly 40 years, and they had that kind of love that people dream about. They were partners in everything, raising my sister Olivia, 28, and me, running our family business, and even growing old together. Our house was always filled with laughter, the smell of home-cooked meals, and the comfort of knowing that no matter what happened, we had each other. Growing up, our family was close. We weren't rich, but my parents worked hard to provide for us, making sure Olivia and I never went without. Mom was the heart of the family, always planning our weekends, organizing family dinners, and making sure everyone stayed connected. Dad was quieter, more reserved, but his love for Mom was clear in every little thing he did, bringing her coffee in bed, holding her hand when they walked, and dancing with her in the kitchen on Sunday mornings. The perfect home. Our house was filled with warmth and little traditions that made every day feel special. Friday nights were always movie nights, with Mom's homemade popcorn and the same old arguments over which film to watch. On Sundays, we'd have big family breakfasts, and even as adults, Olivia and I would still come by, just to be part of the familiar routine. Our lives were woven together by these simple rituals that made us feel like nothing could ever change. Olivia and I were the best of friends growing up. We'd play in the backyard until the sun went down, share secrets late into the night, and support each other through every up and down. Even as we got older and life took us in different directions, our bond remained strong, rooted in the love our parents had nurtured in us. The diagnosis, an unexpected blow. When Mom was diagnosed with a heart condition a couple of years ago, it hit us all hard. She'd always been so vibrant and full of life, and it was difficult to see her slow down. We had been out celebrating Dad's 60th birthday when Mom fainted at the restaurant. What we thought was just exhaustion turned out to be much more serious. The doctors said her heart was weak, and she needed to make significant lifestyle changes, along with regular medical checkups. Mom, however, was determined not to let the diagnosis change her. She kept hosting family dinners, tending her garden, and making sure everyone else was taken care of, even when she should have been resting. She managed her health as best as she could while still being the glue that kept our family together. Dad, in his quiet way, became her biggest supporter, never missing a doctor's appointment and learning to cook her favorite low-sodium meals. I tried to help as much as I could, but it was clear that Dad and Mom were each other's lifelines. The day that changed everything. Then, last year, everything changed. Mom had a sudden heart attack one morning while Dad was out running errands. I remember the panic in his voice when he called me, saying she was being rushed to the hospital. I dropped everything and drove there as fast as I could, praying that it wasn't as bad as it sounded, only to be told that she didn't make it. The doctors said it was quick, but that was little comfort. The grief hit like a freight train, immediate, crushing, and all-consuming. I remember sitting in the hospital's cold, sterile waiting room, staring blankly at the walls, unable to process that she was really gone. Olivia flew in as soon as she heard, and we sat there together, holding each other and crying like we were kids again. Dad was inconsolable. He kept whispering Mom's name, over and over, like saying it would bring her back. The funeral was a blur. Friends, family, and neighbors came to pay their respects, but their words felt hollow. Everyone said the same things: she was so full of life, she loved you all so much, she's in a better place, but all I could think was that she wasn't here, and our family would never be the same. A house full of ghosts. After Mom passed, the house felt like a shell of what it once was. Every room was filled with memories of her, the scent of her perfume lingering in the air, the sight of her knitting needles left untouched, the family photos on the wall capturing happier times. I moved back in with Dad temporarily, thinking it would help us both cope. Olivia was living across the country for her job and couldn't be there as often, so it was mostly just Dad and me, trying to navigate the void Mom had left behind. I tried to keep things together, cooking meals, cleaning the house, and keeping up with the bills. But every little task was a reminder that Mom was no longer there to do them. I'd catch Dad sitting in her favorite chair, staring at old photos or reading her journals, and my heart would break all over again. He wasn't just grieving, he was lost, like a man without a compass, unsure of how to navigate the world without his other half. After months of silence and solitude, Dad surprised me one day by announcing that he'd started going to a grief support group. I was relieved. It was the first sign that he was trying to move forward. He'd been closed off for so long that I worried he'd never be able to find his footing again. When he came home from those meetings, he seemed lighter, more engaged, and even started showing interest in the store again. It felt like a small victory in a long battle. But then, just a few weeks later, he dropped another bombshell. He'd met someone. Her name was Sandra, and she was also in the grief group. She'd lost her husband a few years ago, and they'd bonded over their shared experiences. I didn't know how to feel. On one hand, I was glad that Dad was finding comfort in someone who understood his pain. On the other, it was jarring to think about him with another woman so soon after Mom's death. Meeting Sandra, first impressions. Dad brought Sandra over for dinner one evening, eager to introduce her. I wasn't sure what to expect, but I tried to keep an open mind. Sandra was about 10 years younger than Dad, with perfectly styled blonde hair, designer clothes, and a smile that seemed a little too polished. She was charming and pleasant, making small talk about the grief group and how much it had helped her. Sandra had a way of making herself the center of attention without seeming obvious about it. She'd drop little hints about her past, her glamorous trips abroad, her high-profile social circle, and the charitable work she was involved in. It all seemed rehearsed, like she was trying to sell us a carefully crafted image. But she was attentive to Dad in a way that I hadn't seen since Mom passed. She laughed at his jokes, touched his arm affectionately, and constantly complimented him on how well he was doing. The first dinner was awkward, filled with forced smiles and polite conversation. Sandra asked a lot of questions about the family business, specifically about how the store was doing financially. It felt odd, like she was probing for information rather than making conversation. I brushed it off, thinking she was just trying to connect, but Olivia and I exchanged glances that said we were both on edge. A fast-moving relationship. Sandra and Dad's relationship moved quickly. Within a month, she was spending most of her time at our house, cooking meals, redecorating rooms, and even talking about taking trips together. It was all happening so fast that my head was spinning. One moment, we were grieving the loss of Mom, and the next, Sandra was filling the void, slipping into a role that I wasn't sure she belonged in. Olivia came to visit a couple of times during this period, and she was just as blindsided by Sandra's sudden presence. We talked late into the night after Sandra had gone to bed, trying to make sense of it all. Olivia was more skeptical than I was, pointing out the little things Sandra did that seemed off, the way she'd subtly criticize how we kept the house, her constant need to be involved in every decision, and the way she always seemed to be fishing for information. "I don't know, Ethan," Olivia said one night as we sat on the back porch, sipping beers. "She just feels opportunistic. Like she's trying too hard to fit in." Olivia was right. Sandra was always one step ahead, always making suggestions that subtly edged us out of our roles. She'd tell Dad that the house needed new curtains because the old ones were outdated, or that the store needed to change its inventory to attract a younger crowd. And every time, Dad would agree, as if Sandra's opinions were gospel. I wanted to believe that Sandra was genuinely interested in helping, but the changes she made felt invasive. Mom's old recipes were replaced with fancy new dishes, the furniture was rearranged to reflect Sandra's style, and even the family photos were moved from their prominent place in the living room to a less visible hallway. It was like she was erasing every trace of Mom and inserting herself instead. Sandra's involvement in the family business. What bothered me most was how quickly Sandra became involved in the family business. The hardware store had been in our family for decades, and while it wasn't a goldmine, it provided enough for us to live comfortably. Sandra started coming to the store regularly, offering unsolicited advice on everything from marketing strategies to employee management. She'd stand behind the counter, smiling and chatting with customers as if she were part of the family. One afternoon, she suggested that the store needed a modern touch, proposing that we start selling upscale home decor items instead of the practical tools and supplies we'd always stocked. Dad was enthusiastic, saying it was a great idea, but I was skeptical. The store had always been about quality and reliability, not trendy, overpriced knickknacks. Sandra convinced Dad to invest in the changes, spending money on a new interior design and inventory that didn't fit our brand. Sales started to dip, but every time I raised my concerns, Dad brushed me off, echoing Sandra's reassurances that it was just growing pains. It was frustrating, watching everything Mom and Dad had built being reshaped into something unrecognizable. As Sandra became more entrenched in our lives, little things started to change. It was subtle at first, small, seemingly innocent actions that didn't add up. She'd reorganize Dad's finances, telling him that she was just trying to help him get things in order. She'd suggest changes at the store, offering advice on inventory and pricing even though she had no experience in retail. Dad was thrilled to have someone taking an interest, but to me, it felt like Sandra was slowly inching her way into every aspect of our lives. The missing money. Then, one day, I noticed that some of the store's receipts weren't matching up. There were discrepancies in the accounts, small amounts at first, but enough to catch my attention. I double-checked everything, thinking I'd made a mistake, but the more I looked, the more inconsistencies I found. Money was being moved around, and expenses were being logged that I didn't recognize. I approached Dad about it, showing him the numbers and asking if he knew what was going on. He looked puzzled, but then brushed it off, saying that he'd recently given Sandra access to the store's accounts to help with the bookkeeping. "She's been a lifesaver," he said, smiling. "I'm terrible with this stuff." My stomach dropped. Sandra had no business handling the store's finances, especially without consulting me. I tried to explain to Dad that something wasn't right, that there were funds missing, but he was defensive. "Sandra's just trying to help," he insisted. "You're overreacting, Ethan." It was like talking to a wall. Dad was completely smitten with Sandra, and no matter what I said, he refused to believe that she could be doing anything wrong. I decided to keep a closer eye on the accounts, hoping that I could catch whatever was happening before it got worse. Sandra's influence grows. Sandra's influence over Dad only continued to grow. She convinced him to sell the family's vacation cabin, claiming that it was too much upkeep and that the money could be better spent elsewhere. I tried to argue that the cabin was one of the last things we had left from Mom. It was where we'd spent every summer, where we'd made some of our best memories, but Dad wouldn't hear it. He sided with Sandra, and within weeks, the cabin was gone, sold to some out-of-state buyers without so much as a family discussion. Olivia was furious when she found out. She called me, her voice shaking with anger. "I can't believe he sold it, Ethan. That was Mom's favorite place. How could he just let it go like that?" I didn't have an answer. I was just as hurt, but I was also starting to see how deeply Sandra had embedded herself into our lives. She had Dad wrapped around her finger, and he was making decisions based on what she wanted, not what was best for our family. The missing jewelry. Things escalated further when I noticed that some of Mom's jewelry was missing. She had a small collection, nothing extravagant, but pieces that held sentimental value. A locket she'd worn on her wedding day, a bracelet Dad had given her on their 25th anniversary, and a sapphire ring that had been passed down from her grandmother. I kept the jewelry in a box in my room, intending to give some of it to Olivia one day. But when I went to look for the locket, it was gone. I tore the room apart, searching every drawer and shelf, but it was nowhere to be found. I asked Dad if he'd seen it, but he just shrugged, saying he hadn't touched any of Mom's things since she passed. The thought crossed my mind that Sandra might have taken it, but I couldn't prove anything. I didn't want to accuse her without evidence, but the suspicion gnawed at me. I decided to bring it up with Dad, choosing my words carefully so as not to sound accusatory. "I noticed some of Mom's jewelry is missing," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. "Have you seen it anywhere?" Dad looked up from his newspaper, frowning. "No, I haven't." "Are you sure it's not just misplaced?" "I'm sure," I said, trying to hide my frustration. "It's always in the same spot, and now it's just gone." Sandra, who had been sitting at the kitchen counter, chimed in with a saccharine smile. "Oh, Ethan, you know how things get lost around here. I'm sure it'll turn up. Maybe you should check the attic." The attic? Mom's jewelry had never been anywhere near the attic. I didn't say anything, but the way Sandra avoided eye contact spoke volumes. I knew then that she was involved, but without proof, there was nothing I could do. The more I watched Sandra, the more convinced I became that she was manipulating Dad and using him for his money. Every instinct in me screamed that she was trouble, but Dad was too blinded by his need for companionship to see it. I felt helpless, trapped between wanting to protect my father and not wanting to push him away. But as the red flags continued to pile up, I knew I couldn't stay silent any longer. A tense confrontation. One evening, after a long day at the store, I came home to find Sandra sitting at the dining table, flipping through financial statements that I hadn't even seen yet. It was the last straw. I marched over, snatching the papers from her hands. "What the hell are you doing with these?" Sandra feigned innocence, her eyes widening. "I was just organizing them for your father. He asked me to help out, and I thought." "You thought what?" I interrupted, my voice rising. "That you could just stick your nose into our business? You have no right to be going through these, Sandra." Dad, who had been in the living room, rushed over, looking flustered. "Ethan, calm down," he said, putting a hand on my shoulder. "Sandra's just trying to help. There's no need to yell." I turned to him, my frustration boiling over. "She's not helping, Dad. She's overstepping. And I've been noticing money missing from the accounts. Can you explain that?" Sandra put on a hurt expression, playing the victim perfectly. "I would never do anything to hurt this family, Ethan. I love your father, and I just want to help him get back on track." I couldn't believe her audacity. She was playing my dad like a fiddle, and he was too blinded by his need for comfort to see it. "I've tried to be patient, but this is too much. She's been manipulating you, Dad. She's taking advantage of you, and you can't even see it." Dad's face turned red, a mix of anger and hurt. "You need to stop this, Ethan. Sandra's been nothing but kind to us. You're just upset because things are changing, and you're looking for someone to blame." I was stunned. My own father was siding with this woman who had been in our lives for barely a few months over his own son. I felt a surge of anger, but underneath it was a deep, aching sadness. Mom had been gone for less than a year, and already Dad was letting someone else take her place, letting this stranger worm her way into our family's life and finances. "Open your eyes, Dad," I said, my voice cracking. "She's not who you think she is." But Dad wasn't hearing it. He threw his hands up, clearly fed up with the argument. "If you can't accept Sandra, maybe you should think about finding your own place. I don't need this kind of drama." The pain of rejection. I stared at him, disbelief washing over me. He was choosing Sandra, this woman he barely knew, over his own son. I couldn't fathom how we'd gotten here, how Dad had gone from being my rock to siding with someone who was clearly using him. Without another word, I turned and left the house, slamming the door behind me. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to process everything, but all I felt was betrayal. I'd lost my mom, and now I was losing my dad too, all because of Sandra. The rejection stung deeply. I found myself replaying every argument, every missed sign, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. Dad had always been the one to keep me grounded, the one whose approval I'd sought, and now he'd pushed me away for someone who didn't care about him the way our family did. Reaching out to Olivia. I called Olivia the next day, needing to vent about what had happened. She listened quietly as I recounted the confrontation, and I could hear the frustration in her voice when she finally spoke. "I knew she was bad news," Olivia said. "But Dad's in so deep, he can't see straight. He's desperate for anything that feels normal, and Sandra's taking advantage of that." We spent hours on the phone, brainstorming ways to get through to Dad. Olivia suggested sitting down with him privately, showing him the discrepancies in the accounts and explaining why we were so worried. But I'd already tried that, and Dad had brushed me off. He was so wrapped up in Sandra's web that logic and reason didn't seem to matter. "I'll come home this weekend," Olivia finally said, her voice firm. "We'll talk to him together. Maybe he'll listen if we both sit him down." I agreed, grateful that Olivia was willing to step in. We'd been drifting apart since Mom's death, but now it felt like we were on the same page, united in our concern for Dad. I hoped that with both of us there, we could finally break through the fog and get him to see Sandra for who she really was. Olivia arrived that Friday, and together, we sat down in the kitchen, going over the financial statements and discussing how we were going to approach Dad. We knew it wouldn't be easy, he was stubborn, and Sandra had him wrapped around her finger, but we were determined to make him see the truth. The intervention, laying it all out. That evening, we called Dad into the kitchen, asking him to sit down with us. He looked wary, sensing that this wasn't just a casual chat. Olivia started, her tone calm but serious. "Dad, we're worried about you. Sandra's been getting involved in things that she shouldn't be, and we've noticed some concerning patterns." I pulled out the financial statements, highlighting the missing funds and unexplained transactions. "This isn't just about the store, Dad. It's about Mom's jewelry, the cabin, and everything else. Things are disappearing, and Sandra's the only one with access." Dad glanced over the papers, but he seemed more annoyed than alarmed. "I've been managing just fine, Ethan. I appreciate your concern, but Sandra's been a big help. You're making a mountain out of a molehill." Olivia tried to reason with him, pointing out how quickly Sandra had moved into our lives, how she'd slowly taken over every aspect of the house, the store, and even Dad's personal accounts. "This isn't normal, Dad. She's manipulating you, and you can't see it because you're grieving." But Dad was defensive, refusing to see what was right in front of him. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising. "I'm lonely. I've lost the love of my life, and Sandra's been there when no one else was." His words stung. Olivia and I had been there, but our efforts seemed to pale in comparison to Sandra's calculated presence. I tried one last time to get through to him, my voice filled with frustration and desperation. "We're not trying to hurt you, Dad. We just don't want you to get taken advantage of." Dad's eyes flashed with anger, and for a moment, I didn't recognize the man sitting in front of me. "I appreciate your concern, but you're crossing the line. If you can't respect my decisions, then maybe it's time you both went your own way." The ultimate betrayal. Olivia and I sat there, stunned into silence. Dad was willing to cut us out of his life to protect Sandra. I felt a mixture of anger, sadness, and helplessness, knowing that we'd done everything we could, but it wasn't enough. We left the house that night, both of us too drained to say much as we drove to a nearby motel. Olivia looked over at me as we sat in the dimly lit room, her eyes filled with tears. "We tried, Ethan. We really did." I nodded, feeling the weight of our failed intervention. We'd lost Dad, not just to Sandra but to his own refusal to see the truth. It was like Mom's death had broken something in him that couldn't be fixed, and no amount of reasoning would change that. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into work, trying to keep the store running while avoiding any contact with Dad and Sandra. I'd see them occasionally, driving around town, and every time it felt like a punch to the gut. Olivia returned to her job, but we stayed in touch, both of us struggling to cope with the realization that our family was falling apart. The call that confirmed my worst fears. One afternoon, I received a call from the bank. It was about an account that had been flagged for suspicious activity, one of the accounts tied to the store's finances. I felt my heart sink as the banker explained that several large withdrawals had been made in the past month, totaling thousands of dollars. My mind immediately went to Sandra. She was the only one with access to that account besides Dad, and I knew she was behind it. I rushed to the bank, demanding to see the security footage of the withdrawals. My hands shook as I watched the grainy video feed, and there she was, Sandra, cool as ever, walking up to the counter and withdrawing the money in cash. She'd been stealing right under our noses, and now I had the proof. I called Olivia, telling her what I'd found. "It's worse than we thought," I said, anger boiling inside me. "Sandra's been siphoning money from the store. I've got the footage to prove it." Olivia was livid. "We need to show Dad. He can't ignore this. He has to see what she's been doing." The confrontation, unmasking Sandra. That evening, we went back to Dad's house, armed with the evidence. I was nervous, but also fueled by a determination to finally expose Sandra for who she really was. We walked in, and Sandra was sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine as if she owned the place. Dad greeted us with a forced smile, clearly still upset about our last conversation. "What's this about?" I handed him the bank statements, the withdrawal slips, and the security footage stills. "This is what Sandra's been doing," I said, my voice steady. "She's been stealing from you, from the store, from the family." Dad looked at the papers, his face going pale as he realized what he was seeing. Sandra stood up, her expression shifting from surprise to anger. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. "They're trying to frame me, David. They've been against me from the start." But Dad wasn't buying it anymore. For the first time, he seemed to see Sandra clearly, the lies, the manipulation, and the betrayal. He turned to her, his voice filled with hurt. "Is this true, Sandra? Did you really take the money?" Sandra faltered, unable to keep up her facade any longer. "David, I can explain." But Dad cut her off, his voice breaking. "Get out. Now. I don't want to hear it." Sandra tried to protest, but Dad wouldn't listen. He grabbed her purse, tossing it to her as she stood there, stunned and speechless. Olivia and I watched as she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. It was a small victory, but it felt hollow. We'd finally exposed Sandra, but the damage she'd done to our family couldn't be undone. Picking up the pieces. Dad was devastated, not just because of the money but because he'd let Sandra into his life, his heart, and his home. He apologized to Olivia and me, admitting that he'd been blinded by his grief and loneliness. We forgave him, but the pain of the past year wasn't something that would disappear overnight. I helped Dad go through the accounts, filing reports with the bank and the police to try and recover what we could. Sandra was long gone, but her impact lingered, a painful reminder of how quickly trust could be shattered. Olivia and I spent more time with Dad, slowly rebuilding the bonds that had been frayed by Sandra's deception. We'd sit around the kitchen table, talking late into the night about Mom, the store, and the future. It wasn't easy, but we were determined to move forward together, honoring Mom's memory by staying connected and supporting one another. Dad started going back to the store, taking an active role in managing the business again. He was still grieving, still processing everything that had happened, but there was a newfound resolve in him, a determination to make things right. We found comfort in each other, in the shared experiences that had tested us but ultimately brought us closer. The road to healing. Months later, the house began to feel like home again. We cleared out the last of Sandra's things, redecorating with Mom's old photos and knickknacks that had been tucked away. It was a small but significant step in reclaiming our space, our memories, and our sense of family. Olivia visited more often, and the three of us would spend weekends together, cooking, laughing, and finding joy in the simple moments that we'd once taken for granted. We weren't perfect, and there were still days when the weight of our loss felt overwhelming, but we were healing, slowly but surely. To anyone out there struggling with family betrayal, know that you're not alone. It's okay to feel hurt, to be angry, and to demand better. But it's also okay to forgive, to let go, and to rebuild in your own time. We're all just doing the best we can, and sometimes, that's enough. Thank you for listening, Reddit. This journey has been full of pain, unexpected twists, and hard-earned lessons, but it's also been a reminder of the strength we find in each other. Here's to new beginnings, to family, and to moving forward one day at a time.